Well, hello to all my office workplace warriors, and welcome back to another installment of Dear HR Diary, the unfiltered truth of what you wish they taught you in management school. Ain't that the truth? I am Dawn Hart. I am your host, and I am excited to have a guest today. Her name is Victoria. She is an award-winning executive leader and a best-selling author. And I am fortunate enough because she is in demand public speaker and a corporate executive. So lots of experience coming to us today from Victoria. We are in for a real treat to talk about all things leadership and adventures in that corporate journey that we all have experienced. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Victoria, and let you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about who you are, and what, like, an interesting fact that you might want to share with us.
Okay. Well, about me. So I know you gave a little bit of my bio, but I'm a 20 plus year now, which makes me feel very old. C-suite executive, having stepped into my first C-suite role at age 24 as the COO of a large outsourcing company or BPO company, and I had plans, by the way, of going to law school, but I worked in a bank throughout university and got promoted up through the ranks. I'd already been a people leader prior to that, however, and I just realized how much I loved the business world and I enjoyed being a leader, and particularly in the world of B2B, which is where I've stayed ever since that like COO role, because there's an added like complexity to having just one other like stakeholder to serve between a corporate client, and then you're serving either their employees or their customers. And of course, you've got shareholders and executives and your employees and all of those things. So I've stayed there ever since in a few different slices, and it's spent the last almost 10 years or so marrying my like maniacal focus around healthy cultures and the right kind of leadership, where it became my day job. I started running human capital businesses,
Oh, yeah.
consulting and delivering services to others. So that's a little bit on the corporate front. Sit on board, speaking, all this other stuff. I'm a wife, mom, fitness fanatic, foodie, wine lover. And fun fact, your audience will maybe pick up the slightest accent, generally only when I say two words, out and about. So that'll tell you I'm Canadian originally. And my fun fact, however, now that I've told you I'm Canadian, played hockey for 20 something years, including coaching my kids. Love it. But now that I live in South Florida, that's not happening so much.
Yeah, not a whole lot of ice down there in South Florida. Well, we would hope there's not a whole lot of ice in South Florida. Oh
Yeah.
my God, 24 years old going into the C-suite. Like, what was that like, especially for someone that, I mean, that's young. I didn't get into the executive level until I was probably in my maybe early 40s. So that's a whole new ball of wax, like taking on that responsibility.
Yeah. Now I started working at 11. By 14, I was the assistant manager of the shoe store I worked at in high school. By 16, I was like kind of the leader of leaders. And then when I was in university and working, in a banking environment, I got promoted up to like directorship level, even at that point. So as I said, I had a number of years of not only work experience, but like leadership experience when I stepped into that role. But it was still very much a stretch role for me. I stepped into it. I mean, there was a number of reasons they, put me and recruited me into that role. It was large contact center operations, the world of BPO and outsourcing, which I did have significant experience in. They had many financial services clients, and I'd come out of working at two of Canada's largest banks. Uh, but the rest was very much a stretch role for me. So going from this operational experience in a BDC environment to all of a sudden leading everything except finance.
Mm.
But so I had operations, contact center, and banking. And I will say I had confidence. I have this like big person complex. I'm only 5'8", but I hit this height by the time I was like 11, I think.
Oh my
Um,
God.
yeah, and so like I was taller than my teachers. When you look at your school photos, like I'm the kid in the middle back row all the time. And then I skipped a couple grades and then finally it evened out with everyone. But so one, I've always felt bigger. And I'm not a fan of fake it till you make it, except when it comes to confidence, because confidence is also perceived as competence. And so I
Oh,
showed up in a very good way. And so I think that's how I stepped into that role. But I still had to learn a lot. I still had to lean on team members who knew all the other functional areas I didn't. And I failed a lot too. And,
yeah.
fail fast and learn from those opportunities.
It's interesting. So you started your leadership at a really young age, right? And so I think what I find interesting, because I started babysitting when I was 10, and I was like babysitting 3-year-olds. And I'm thinking, who in the hell put me in charge of children? I mean, this was in the early 80s. So it was like really nothing, kind of crazy. But a lot of times when women, particularly, demonstrate leadership skills, they get called, bossy. So I always thought, that's not bossy. I'm just confident. I just know what the hell I want. So call me bossy if you want. I've never been insulted by that. And
Do you know,
I
I have a shirt that says, I'm not bossy, I'm aggressively helpful.
I love that. I think, I have 5 children and 4 of them are boys. And my youngest is a girl, and I talk a lot about her on my podcast. But she is a freshman at the University of Oklahoma. And shout out to the Sooners. But her whole life very similar. My husband is the president of a bank, and I, am a director, and I've always been a little bit bossy, if you will. So as she was growing up, I saw a lot of that, and she got told she was bossy. And I'm like, listen, you just tell people you're authoritative. You know what you want, and you're going to get it. And so she very much has taken that to heart and continues to do that, even in organizations that she is active in. So it's always fun. So when you talk life lessons, particularly at such a young age, because you talked about fail fast, right? So what are some things that you failed fast at that you really felt helped build the foundation for where you are today?
A few things, and one wasn't as fast as I would have liked that I will talk about. But so when I said I needed to lean on team members that knew these functional areas that I didn't, I had some very early missteps in terms of I am the type who you instantly earn, like, you have trust with me until you break it. And there were some early signs with a couple of the leaders I probably should have taken action on much sooner. But I mean, mind you, I did it within 6 months, so that was still, fast. But I think I knew within weeks. And so that was one. Two is there were moments that because I was 24 years old, I was the only female executive, not to mention the youngest by probably a couple of decades. I did show up with like a mask of this, like, all business all the time. I'm not showing you that I'm vulnerable, emotional, any of those things. And a couple of times I also was like, I pretended I knew stuff I didn't. And so that
Yeah.
was a failure for me. And I've learned. And so now I'm like the first to put my hand up and say, I don't know what I don't know. And I have an amazing team around me. And I'll find either the answer or the person, and bring them to the table. So that was a fail fast. The one that took a little bit longer was also related to the mask I wore. And it was a couple of years into my executive leadership journey that I learned I'd garnered the nickname the Iron Maiden.
Oh,
Um, right. And so when I first heard it, like, it took me even a couple of months to kind of really, I was like, oh, well, that's unfortunate. But I had just done pretty significant performance management exercises and a restructuring. So I kind of blamed it a little bit on the fact that I'd had to make some really tough decisions in the business. But it was a couple months later, there was a reinforcement of that by just talking with a peer, actually, who I joked about crying at a movie in the movie theater on the weekend. And she looked at me and she's like, oh, Vic, I thought you'd be the type of person who'd laugh at people who cry at movies. Oof.
mm,
So that, Donna, that for me was like, that was the slap of the face. So Iron Maiden, and then hearing this, I was like, okay, well, I'm clearly being perceived in a way. It's not actually who I am. My
right.
nickname is Turtle for my best friend. Very tough exterior, extremely resilient, but like soft and marshmallowy. So that was a longer realization of a failure for me. I think people feared me. I had success in business, but they probably feared me versus would have followed me into the proverbial fire. So that one took longer to pivot and change because not all of it felt comfortable or natural for me. But
Yeah.
I had to. So that's been my biggest leadership failure. And it took, like I said, a while to pivot and change. And now I'm just innately, I think I shouldn't say that. Innately, I was always the same person. My
Mhm.
comfort in showing up very differently has changed, and learning to lead and build relationships, and be authentic and vulnerable and much more transparent has changed.
Oh my gosh, fantastic example. I got one of the ladies that I'm fortunate enough to mentor. I'm a mentor for her. She asked me, she recently moved into a role, and she's like, how do you battle imposter syndrome as a new manager, and particularly a new HR manager? And I said, listen, first of all, you have to give yourself a lot of grace because you're not going to know the answers. And I said, tell me what the situation was. And she said she'd made a pretty hefty, big mistake at work. And while her team members were great about supporting her, she really kind of beat herself up over the whole thing. And I said, listen, I made a mistake at work. Probably make mistakes every day at work. But one I made in front of a senior leadership team, and I misspoke and misquoted some numbers. And I very much kind of fell on the sword later, and I was too embarrassed to say I don't know the answer, and nor do I not know the answer, but I don't know where to go get the answer. It was almost like I was paralyzed, and so I later look back on that and think, how would I have handled that differently? Much better. I would have been like, listen, I don't know the answer. And I know as an HR person or even as a senior leader on this team, I probably should know the answer, but please allow me the opportunity to find out. And in talking through that to her, she was like, I just feel like I need to be perfect and I should have the answer. And I'm like, you're just not gonna have the answer all the time. You just won't, no matter what. And she said, well, what happens if I don't know the answer? How does that deteriorate trust? And so that's a valid question. When you don't know the answer, how do you convey that people should trust you to go get it?
Mm.
So she was like, oh my God, like very eye-opening. First of all, give yourself
Good.
grace. I mean, seriously.
That's right. Exactly.
We just don't know. But yeah, I think that's valid. And I also think as women, we probably tend to be a lot harder on ourselves. I had a very similar story to yours when I was in when I first started human resources, and my CEO pulled me to the side and he said, this is a hard conversation to have with you because I really know who you are, but there are people on the team that think that you're kind of stuck up. And I'm like, what? Like, what do you mean? And he said, you always are very well put together. You're very well dressed. You carry yourself differently. And I was working for a credit union in a pretty economically challenged area. And the people that worked for us were of that same makeup, right? So they came from low income homes. We had low income members. And here's this HR person that comes in always very well dressed. And he said, you just have this air about you that you're kind of stuck up. And I'm thinking, holy crap, like I'm like so far from being stuck up. It was just I grew up on a acreage with horse dung everywhere. So it was very well. But I also thought, well, I wonder what it is. Well, I mean, I shopped at Walmart, I shopped at TJ Maxx, but it was just how I carried myself. And I almost to a point was like, well, I don't want to apologize who I am, but maybe I really need to manage people. Like I need to manage each person differently. So have you noticed that throughout your career, that as you have people that you're managing, are you adapting your own personal management style to each individual person? How do you make that shift?
Yeah, absolutely. I do. And I actually even start with, when working with people, acknowledging to them that I'm very aware of my own personality and traits. And there's things that I encourage for them and that I don't set a good example for. So for example, I prefer to say work-life integration, but most people say work-life balance.
Yeah,
I
I'm glad
don't,
you life balance.
no, I don't know. No, but I've never set like great examples of that. By my choice, I choose not to disconnect. When I go on vacation, I choose to be on my emails because I don't want to come back to 1,000 of them. I'm not hopping on conference calls all the time, but that's my choice. But so I say to my team, first of all, I do as I say, not as I do. And you need to figure out what's right for you. So I will start with that just by acknowledging, who I am and how that shows up, from a work perspective. And then, yes, I very much like tailor the way I lead and coach other people based upon, their individual styles. And for me, I've actually trademarked sort of whole human leadership, and I have a book coming out later around that. And that's a little bit around my own journey and my failure to leadership to learn how to do it differently. And by whole human leadership, it is, the humanity in the way in which we lead and recognize we are whole humans who show up every day. And certainly during COVID time, there was no separation as we see these square boxes and we're in seeing each other's homes. So there was no separation, and we can't park the crappy stuff that might have happened on the weekend or in our past when we show up every day. Compartmentalizing doesn't always work. Certainly
Right.
you shouldn't for long term. And so one is a leader recognizing that. And it also means bringing empathy, again, vulnerability, transparency in the way we communicate. That works for everyone, but there's different ways I kind of tackled that, particularly as I'm having to have performance management conversations.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That's such so, very old school, kind of baby boomerish, if you will, and a little bit Gen X, and I'm a Gen Xer, so I'll own that. But we tend to say, leave your issues at the door. And I've heard people say, well, they should leave their personal stuff at the door when they walk through the door at work. Like they don't need to bring that in the door. And so my question is, why do you only want half your person to show up at work? Like we're not multiple, maybe some of us are split personalities. I don't know, but multiple personalities where it's like, okay, Dawn Hart, the mom, the wife, the sorority girl, the dog mom, whatever, insert here. How am I going to park that at the door and now become Dawn Hart, the manager or the employee? That like it's the same whole person. I would want the whole person to come to work and feel supported, as opposed to you don't give a crap about Dawn Hart the mom or Dawn Hart the sorority girl. To me, I just think that sends a really big disconnect message. And I tell my employees and my managers when I do management training, I'm very much like, you want that whole person to come to work, because when they feel supported and they feel cared about, they're going to bring that whole person to work each and every day, because they know, they might show up and they just had to clean up, kitty do, or, their kid threw up on them, or they have a big coffee spot on them. And it's okay, because they want to feel accepted and they want to feel like you really care about them. And if you don't, then they're going to take their whole person somewhere else. Have you seen throughout your career kind of a change in that attitude or that acceptance of kind of that? I know in my almost 30 years of working in HR, it seems like there tends to be a little bit of a shift.
I have definitely seen a shift. And so like you, I'm a Gen Xer, and all of the examples of, of leadership was much more of the style in which you described. And so actually, well, people will ask me like, who do I have as mentors? I actually have the reverse. I have reverse mentorship, and in the negative/positive way. For me, I've seen people who've operated in the kind of leadership I never want to become, or
Yes.
that early view of myself. And so I've seen it shift, in part just a generational shift. So we are leading differently. Our younger generation are wanting something very different. And I've seen a massive like move of the pendulum. Again, COVID, horrible time for, all of us. However, I do think there's some pretty significant positives that came out of it. And I don't like the social headlines of like great resignation and quiet quitting. The reality is there was a shift in the workforce. And
Right.
that was one that people wanted to work for companies and work for leaders that were connected to purpose and shared values.
Mhm.
And two, it was much more a sense of feeling valued. And that comes again with a very different kind of leadership. And so and so maybe this is what, why you're spending a lot of time in this leadership coaching side, is because many didn't learn it. And by the way, I joke that I think that's what's missing from MBA. For everyone who goes to get MBAs, it's like they teach you, how to read a P&L statement and like deal with challenging business situations. But particularly with technology and AI, the stuff that all gets left behind is
Mhm.
actually the human skills.
Yeah.
And so I am very much seeing a shift, and it's being demanded of the workforce, of certainly, I think our generation maybe a little less so, but definitely the newer generation. I've got two in the workforce. My kids are 23 and 19. Even if they're working, well, the older one's out of college now, but
Yeah.
I hear from them.
I have five, and all five of them are in the workforce. One of them's actually in the Army. And so that's kind of a, a whole different, a whole
Yeah,
different
very different.
ballpark. Although he himself calls me and he's like, "Hey mom, I need your help. Like, how do I manage this, crazy little 18-year-old kid?" And I'm like, first of all, he's only 7 years younger than you, but okay. Uh, I 100% have seen that. And the baby boomers are kind of peace out. We're out of here. We're getting ready to retire. And these Gen Xers, while we're used to kind of being on our own, I think we tend to be a little bit more sympathetic towards our millennials and to our Gen Zs. Some of them are even our kids, if you will. And we see that shift most definitely. Even from the HR standpoint, I have seen a lot more of my boss doesn't care about me. I don't feel connected to the organization. I don't feel like there's enough diversity here. Stuff that when I started, and you for that matter, since you're Gen X like me, we didn't see, or we didn't really pay that much attention to, or there wasn't a whole lot of focus on it. So I definitely have seen that shift over to I really want to feel cared about. I was at a seminar earlier today, and the guest speaker that was talking very similar about this. And when 2019 was, as we were recruiting people, it was we want more money, right? So in 2019, it was like all about comp and benefits. That was like the number one reason. It was like this whole race to find great talent, and how do we retain them? How do we get them? And he asked this question to us. He's like, how many of you, want to attract or retain great talent? And of course, all of us raised our hand. And I'm here in Oklahoma, and it's a really small market for talent, especially in the technology field, because we're not the hotbed of technology here in Oklahoma City. But he goes, look around. These are who you're competing against. But what I tell you is you're going about it wrong. You need to look inward at the retaining your employees. Like, here's what happened. There was this, I hate to talk about COVID and this shift, but it really happened. And if you look at now what people want, and believe it or not, the great resignation was just a great marketing tool more than anything else. He called it fake news, and we all, of course, laughed.
Yeah.
He said, if I look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, particularly in the United States, most people were staying in their job. So that great resignation kind of was increased by social media. But
Yeah.
he also went on to say people are obviously looking for something more than comp and benefits. And the number one thing in 2019 was comp and benefits. So what people wanted, they'd hop the fence for a quarter more. Now it's work-life engagement. And it's not that work-life balance, because I don't believe work-life balance exists. I think you can't, if you're balanced in one area, you can't be balanced in the other. That's a ridiculous notion. But I think it's that work-life engagement. And to me, that ran true when I was thinking, okay, engagement both in my work and engagement both in my life, and how do those come together, and how as a manager do I support that? So
Yeah.
what do you feel like is probably one of the biggest challenges facing new leaders coming into, someone just got promoted, they're a new manager, maybe they were the widget maker last week and now they're the manager of the widget makers this week. What do you think is probably one of their biggest challenges, and how should they prepare for that?
I think there's two. One is I do think the younger generation, however, has expectations very different than you and I had generationally. And this is the demographic that, got given ribbons or awards just for showing up. And so there's a little bit of a, like, I want it all, I want it now. And so, you know, some of these newer leaders, which are getting promoted though, but like how they're managing others and that. So I just think that's a unique dynamic to manage, particularly in North America. But the other is the rapid pace of change,
Mm.
and technology is changing that significantly. So it's not so much where the work's getting done, although I'm seeing most companies landing on some kind of a hybrid model, but how the work is getting done. And so the shelf life of skills is rapidly decreasing, like to 2 or 3 years. And so leaders need to be ahead of that in understanding the workforce they have today, and what success looks like now, and how do you measure that and ensure that's being delivered to the skills of future. So mapping that out to, and I actually think the role of HR is really important in being the strategic business advisor to those leaders to say, here's where the strategy, the business, new products, services, how we're going to go to market, new share of wallet, and assessing what skills are going to be required in that 1, 3, 5 year journey and building that roadmap to it. So I think, how do you develop those skills? And what gets left behind, by the way, as more and more gets automated, is the complex problem solving, the need to be much more innovative. You're handling exceptions, and when you deal with customers, you're dealing with a stuff that didn't make its way through smoothly through the process. And so, how do you coach and develop that? Going back again to human skills. So I think that's a big challenge for leaders of today and will be. How do you deal with change management? And again, addressing the quickly evolving change and skill requirement.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, change management. In fact, today in the seminar, this guy was talking about change management. He was snapping his fingers. He's basically like, okay, it changed. It changed. He's like, literally, your 2.0 today is not going to be your 2.0 in the next 2 days, the next 2 weeks, the next 2 years. He says, so you definitely need to be conscientious of that. I think change management is one of those tools that we definitely need to equip all managers and leaders with. Like, how do you change? And change isn't a 4-letter word. I don't mind change, but I am a creature of habit, so let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
If you tell me why we have to change, tell me why, and then I'll move on. I tend to be okay with that. So yeah. Lastly, kind of what piece of advice would you give to your 24-year-old self? If you had a chance to go back and give your 24-year-old self a piece of advice, what piece of advice would you give young Victoria?
The lessons that I had to learn around being vulnerable, around being authentic, showing up as my whole self. I just hid that for too long.
Yeah.
And the relationships I developed in the workplace just could have flourished so much sooner had I been comfortable with that. And some of that's just purely maturity, confidence that comes with age. But I wish I could have whispered that in that 24-year-old girl's ear to help make it a little smoother.
And you're not the Iron Maiden.
That's right.
Well, Victoria, if anybody wanted to get a hold of you, I want to hear about this book real fast before I end this. Like, tell me, book that's coming out. You have a couple of books. So what's
I
this new?
do. So I'm in career transition, although some stuff in the pipeline for my next C-suite gig, and I'm not good at idle time. So I decided to write a book, but couldn't decide between two topics I spend a lot of time talking and coaching on, one of which is personal branding. So it's called Influence Unleashed, Forging a Lasting Legacy through Personal Branding. That one was released 2 weeks ago. And then I also wrote one on leadership and culture, whole human leadership, that will come out in early summer.
Oh my gosh, so exciting. Okay. Well, and I will put Victoria's links in our show notes. If you want to reach out to her, it'll have her LinkedIn page and her guest website page and her Instagram page. There's all kinds of ways you can get a hold of Victoria. And she is unstoppable and dynamic. I love that. That's awesome. That's a great way to describe it. So, and I love that you're leading the charge, particularly for people when it comes to being vulnerable and being approachable and being, just in this space to care about people. It sounds like such a simple philosophy, but I guess it's a lot harder than people give it credit for, but who knows? Well, thank you so much, Victoria, for joining us today on Dear HR Diary by Manage with Heart, the unfiltered truth. Obviously, we gave you some really unfiltered truth today that they wish you taught in management schools, Victoria alluded to. I completed my organizational leadership degree in December of 2023, so just a couple months ago, and I too wish that they had taught more about how to lead with your heart. No pun intended, since that is my last name. Well, stay fabulous, my lovely office warriors. And until next time, have a fantastic work life.